The next lecture that we had focused on for this semester was describing the nature and extent of youth crime. So looking, for example, at crime rates and how they've changed over time in Canada. But to understand changes in crime, we have to understand where our information on crime comes from. And generally speaking, there are three main sources of crime: the media, official statistics, and information provided by researchers. When it comes to the media, these are things that are sort of like the most easily accessible or most widely available. When it comes to official data, we're talking about data that we might get from police or from courts or from correctional facilities. And these are considered data that are the most reliable. And here's why. When it comes to the recording of crime, let's say if we're looking, for example, at data from courts. Well, the court has to record when somebody was convicted. It has to say the offense that they were convicted of. It has to say the sentence that they received. So we know that this information is going to be really, really accurate. But what we miss from these official data are offenses that go undetected by the justice system. So, for example, we could see that if we're using arrest statistics, well, not all people who commit crime are arrested. Among people who are arrested, not all people go to court. Among people who go to court, some people are found not guilty, and so they're not going to show up in correctional data. So we get reliable data, but it might not necessarily be valid in terms of describing, for example, the general frequency of offending amongst the population. So self-report and victimization surveys are typically thought to be more valid in terms of representing the prevalence of crime or the frequency of crime amongst individuals. So self-report studies are going to be focusing on individuals self-reporting their involvement in crime. Victimization surveys talk about when an individual has been a victim of a crime, and that can sometimes be limited because certain crimes, like drug trafficking, it's difficult to actually identify a specific victim. The problem with self-report studies and victimization surveys is an issue with telescoping. Telescoping is where we report an event that truly did happen, but it happened in the wrong time period or we misremember it and we report it happening in the wrong time period. So let's say that I wanted to know the prevalence of offending amongst individuals in grade 11. So I asked individuals at the start of grade 12, how often were you involved in crime in the last year or when you were in grade 11? So these grade 12 students remember back to grade 11 and they report a particular offense. And one grade 11 student grade 12 student reports a crime that they think happened in grade 11, but it actually happened in grade 10. So yes, the crime did occur, but it actually occurred 2 grades ago. And so we were going to therefore overestimate the prevalence of crime if this person is saying that the crime did happen in grade 11, or we could underestimate the crime if the person thinks that the crime happened in grade 10 when it actually did happen in grade 11. So generally speaking, when we're doing these surveys, we want to make sure that we're not asking individuals to try and recall from a really long period ago. Like, we don't want to do a survey of individuals who are 50 years old and ask them about the age of onset of their first time that they used drugs, for example, or the first time that they committed an assault. When we look at the youth crime rate in Canada, since the 1990s, we've seen a fairly steady decrease, and this is true regardless of the type of crime that we're looking at. One of maybe the misperceptions that people have about crime is that is the perception or their belief that most crime is committed by youth. In reality, in Canada, only about 20% of all crime is committed by kids between ages 12 to 17. What we see is that about 5 to 6% of all individuals might be responsible for about half of all crime. And generally speaking, when youth are involved in violent crime, for example, it's of a relatively minor nature. Much more likely to be committing assaults than things like homicide offenses. In week 13, which will not be on the exam, I talked about some of the reasons for why Indigenous youth are overrepresented in the justice system, and talked about how in this particular point in time, Indigenous youth represent about 25 to 30% of our court population. So this is a really important number to memorize for the exam. But I also don't want students just memorizing the number. It's not enough just to know that Indigenous youth are overrepresented. It's important to understand why this overrepresentation occurs. And to have this understanding, we need to look back at the history of colonialism, the impact of attempted genocide on Indigenous persons, through, for example, effectively like biological warfare with smallpox blankets and things like that, and how this has led to the intergenerational transmission of trauma and how crimes can occur in the context of this trauma. Another reason for overrepresentation can relate to overpolicing, where if we have a particular neighborhood with a higher crime rate than another neighborhood, police may choose to allocate a greater number of policing officers over to that neighborhood. And then that's going to increase the likelihood that people involved in crime in that neighborhood are detected for crime. And that can further contribute to overrepresentation in the justice system. When we look at the patterns of delinquency and offending amongst boys and girls, we can see some pretty key differences. Boys begin earlier. They're longer in their pattern of offending. They're more likely to continue to offend in adulthood. And they're more likely to commit more serious offenses. Boys are more likely to commit homicide offenses. But if we look among boys, so among boys who commit homicide offenses, boys are more likely to kill a non-family member. When we look at girls involved in homicide offenses, girls are more likely to kill a family member.